This is a Religica production. Religica.
Thank you for joining us today.
Yes, my pleasure.
Today we're just excited to learn more about your work and what drives you. Starting off, I'd just like to ask what your field is and also what drove you there.
Yes, great. I am the president of Interfaith Power and Light. We are a faith-based organization based in San Francisco, California, in the United States. And we are completely focused on working with people of all religious traditions on the issue of climate change. And a lot of the work that we do is around, started out really to be around reducing energy use within congregational facilities, so very practical. And we still run programs that do just that. But also another key piece of what we do is advocacy. So we work through our 40 state affiliates around the country at the local, the state, and then also at the national level on climate and energy and transportation policy and supporting the right policies.
How many local affiliates do you have?
We have 40 affiliates, so we are spread out all over the U.S. And we have new ones that are forming in some of our states that don't yet have an affiliate. So we hope that maybe eventually we'll be in all 50 states. And we definitely have supporters in all 50 states, but not affiliates in all 50 states.
I'm interested to learn, I see that it's based out of California. Is that helping drive some of the national agenda for how other states can and should be potentially be thinking about what, faith congregations should be doing in terms of sustainability?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, well, very practically speaking, the reason that it started in San Francisco is because our founder is from San Francisco. And so, of course, she naturally started the organization in the place where she lived. And it really started out because she was an Episcopal priest. It started out through the Episcopal diocese and was originally Episcopal Power and Light and working directly with Episcopalian churches in California. And then, as other faith traditions became really interested and said, we'd really like to do this in our place too, it became interfaith. So it became California Interfaith Power and Light. And then we had other states who said, that's something really interesting that you're doing in California. We'd like to do that in our state as well. And so the state affiliate network has grown up sort of organically as a response to that over the last 18 years or so. And you're right, though. I think California is really leading the way on a lot of sustainability initiatives. It is also a state that is really hard hit by climate change. It's hard hit by drought, by wildfires. And so, we can look at both the impacts of climate change that are happening there, but also the fact that we have some really interesting things happening policy-wise in California. We, for example, just passed a bill called SB 100. It was signed by the governor that will move California to 100% clean energy by 2045. So it's aggressive. It does set a target. The question is always, making sure now that we take steps to implement that and really make it happen.
So I'm curious, from a best practices communications, how have you seen Interfaith Power and Light kind of transition its communications of messages of how have you seen stories being shared across the country?
Yeah, it is a challenge that we face because we know, for example, there are a lot of different organizations and constituencies that are working on the issue of climate and sustainability and environmental concerns. And, the faith voice has a really unique voice to lend to this conversation. And I think in particular, the thing that I feel, is most powerful for us is to really build those connections with people in terms of their values, which is a different conversation necessarily than, you can save money by changing out your light bulbs. And that's important, right? The economic message is important. I think, the messages around health are very important. But I also think that there's a sense in which we need to get to a deeper level in our conversations around the spiritual disconnect that's happening. So, when we abuse the land, when we abuse the water, when we abuse the air, there's this piece that's about being out of harmony with what is sacred. And so for our many faith traditions, we will call the sacred by different names. But, it's in the Judeo-Christian tradition, we'll talk about our separation from God and how we've sort of broken the covenant with God. And part of that covenant has been to be stewards of the land and stewards of the air and stewards of the water. And it is also about how we care for those who are most vulnerable. And, I don't know of a single faith tradition that does not lift up the importance of caring for those who are vulnerable. The second thing I want to say about that is one of the things we've found especially powerful in Interfaith Power and Light is in meeting people where they are. So when we have a conversation with a faith leader, for example, whose congregation is very involved in the issue of hunger or very involved in the issue of immigration, to have a conversation that can connect the dots between climate change and these other issues and build that bridge so that they can understand more deeply how climate change exacerbates those other issues. And so the work that they're doing, for example, with charity on hunger or with charity on immigration, is very important work. And we need to get to sort of the underlying deeper causes and address those root causes. And climate change is certainly one of those root causes. So that gets a little more into the justice piece, which we also think is important. But it is about connecting the dots.
What have you seen as the best way to communicate with your constituents, and how has that evolved, and how do you see it evolving long term?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, there's sort of a both and answer there. Mm-hmm. A big piece of the work that we do is about, learning and growing and getting better, right? Like we all hope we're doing that even as individuals. Mm-hmm. And so one of the ways in for many people is through our programs. And we have programs that we have available through our national office, and then our state affiliates also run a lot of programs sort of in communities, at the very local level. The nice thing about that is, we do, as I said, both programs and advocacy. But for most people, the first ask that you never want to make is schedule a meeting with your member of Congress on this issue, right? Because they'd be terrified and they would say, I can't possibly do that because I don't understand the issue. And so the education piece is really important, and the education really comes through the programs. They might measure their energy use, for example, in their home or their place of worship. They learn about the issue of climate change and how it's connected to our energy use. And they're actually taught ways that they can very practically reduce their energy consumption. And so, it's a little bit about, tending your own garden, what can I do from the personal standpoint? And at the same time, they're learning. They're starting to understand the issue. They're understanding the connection to, for example, their utility provider and how they get their energy. And is it coming from fossil fuels or is it coming from wind and solar?
I'm interested in switching topics a little bit.
Sure.
I'm curious if you're noticing generational trends as well when it comes to engagement, both on climate action as well as the connection between faith and climate action. Mm-hmm. One of the individuals I met recently, he's leading young evangelicals for climate action, and that excited me to see bringing millennial activism with faith as well as with working towards climate action. And I'm curious if you've seen interesting trends. I mean, I'm sure you might have stories across different generations, and I was curious if you could share a few of them with us today.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I'm going to back up and speak to you for a moment and tell you a little bit of my story into working on climate change.
Yeah.
So I am ordained clergy in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, and I've served congregations, and for many years I served congregations. And I had this focus on hunger when I was serving a congregation. And I sort of knew climate change was an issue, but I wasn't really very focused on it. And I thought, well, I'm recycling and doing my thing, so I'm good. But I had a moment where I had this realization through an article that I read about how climate change was exacerbating the issue of hunger. and realizing that, I needed to work on climate change if I was actually going to address hunger. And at the time, this was many years ago, but at the time, I have two sons and they were much younger at the time. They're 22 and 20 now. And so for me, the issue of climate change, the other thing I started realizing was how much harder their generation would be impacted by climate change than even my generation or the generations before me. And it became really personal to me because I felt like I have to be able to look my sons in the eye and tell them that I did everything that I could to work for solutions to this. And so this issue of generational justice has been really important to me. And, I raised these two sons who like to remind me now when I leave a light on in the room, do you know what you do for a living? They sort of bring that up. And also these sons who pay attention to those things, right? Like they understand some of the things that they need to do, even though they're not personally working on climate change, but just in terms of their lifestyle, what they need to do.
Of course, you're working towards climate action because it's in part being stewards of the earth as, sacred, that, faith traditions inspire us. Our religions kind of like call us to work towards being on the right side of history. But as far as the building relevance, I'm curious, especially within the interfaith context, I feel like there's a lot of relevance building potentially being done through your organization in terms of not just working towards climate action, but actually creating a platform for interfaith collaboration. And I'm curious if you have some really interesting examples that maybe our audience would be very interested to hear from, and maybe try to emulate some of that into their own communities.
Yeah. One of the things I would start with is just thinking, within the last couple of years where we've had so many traditions that have come out with their own statements on climate change or creation care, there's sort of a variety of models for that happening. But I look at Laudato Si, Pope Francis's encyclical on the environment, as a really powerful example. So number one of the things that he did within that was say, most encyclicals were specifically for the Catholic people, right? So he was speaking, any pope that came out with an encyclical was speaking to the fellow Catholics. And Pope Francis said that he was speaking to all people. He was really expanding the worldview to look at beyond people of the Catholic faith to say, this is about humanity. This crisis that we're in is about all of humanity, and that we all have a role to play in healing it.
If there's any final thoughts that you might have that our listeners might have an interest in relation to your work, in relation to interfaith light and power, that maybe audience members can maybe start implementing into their daily lives, or simply for them to think about further into the future?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I would urge them to see if there is a state affiliate in their state, because I think the part of the importance of this work is in being in community with one another. Sometimes we feel isolated and like we're the only person who cares about this issue, and so we don't know where to start, or we don't even know what we can do, or we just step back and go on to something else. And so being in community, finding others who share this, core value is, I think, really important for people to, to build these relationships and build these connections with one another. And then I think, learn what you can learn and understand what you can do in your own home, in your own place of worship. And talk to your religious leaders. Sometimes they need the courage to speak on an issue that has become very controversial. And, we'd like to think that caring for creation is not that controversial, right? That our faith traditions call us to that. But the issue of climate change and the terminology around climate change has become so divisive that they need to know that they're supported and that they can use their prophetic voice to speak on this issue. And then finally, I think finding avenues to do advocacy where you are. look at solutions that are very place-based, because we can make the most progress. I think we can really make the most progress at the local level right now. And when cities are doing climate action plans or looking at pollution issues that impact communities of color and frontline communities, indigenous communities in their area, consider how you can be a partner with them in that fight as well and let them lead the way. So those are just a few suggestions, but certainly look us up online. We're at interfaithpowerandlight.org. It's all spelled out, one word, and we'd love to have you join us.
Well, thank you so much for talking to us today.
Thank you.
This podcast was made possible by Religica Allies.